Hello, Sombre here. Today we'll be doing another Warhammer National Overview. These are of course mod nations for the Dominions 5 game, and we'll be looking at the Chaos Dwarfs today. You can see that I haven't got the Chaos Dwarfs mod enabled in the top right corner, instead it's just the Sombre Warhammer mod. That's because I've discontinued the individual nation mods and they're all just included in a single compilation mod going forward. As usual, we're going to start by looking at a nation overview, then we're going to look at the recruitable troops, the recruitable commanders, and then we'll look at any summons, multi-heroes, unique heroes the nation has. We'll then look at any of the national mechanics. We'll move on to looking at spells, and then finally there'll be a quick look, very quick look, at possible pretender selection and any other bits and pieces that I've missed. I should say that this isn't intended to be a guide, it's just an overview of the nation, and like the other overviews I've done before, it's really just to encourage you to give them a try and maybe give you some ideas about what you might like to do with them. So here is the national overview. You can see they're not called Chaos Dwarfs, they're called Zarnagrund, which is kind of the capital of the Chaos Dwarf civilization, and they are a very capital-centric civilization. And they are the children of Hashut. Hashut is the god that they worship. He's a god of darkness and evil and power. He's definitely somewhat related to the Chaos gods, but it's because Chaos Dwarves are kind of an older piece of Warhammer lore. They're not directly linked up with the things that we'd understand to be the Chaos gods. Maybe if the Chaos Dwarves appear in the um, Warhammer Total War 3, then they will give them a bit more of a link, thematic link to the Chaos Gods and explain maybe that Hashut is an aspect of some of the Chaos Gods. I'm not really sure, but he's more of a kind of traditional god than one of the Chaos Gods at least. So the Chaos Dwarfs are the evil cousins of the regular dwarfs. They have a lot of the similar characteristics to the dwarfs, but they are twisted to different ends. So while the dwarfs are kind of isolationist and they're very proud of their work, the Chaos Dwarfs take that to a more extreme in that they're xenophobic and see everyone as lesser than them. And rather than being kind of proud, they're more like arrogant and cruel. So they're kind of the dark mirror version of the normal Warhammer dwarfs, but they have a lot of the similar interests. The big difference between the Chaos Dwarfs and the regular dwarfs is that the Chaos Dwarfs have discovered that they can use magic, although it does come with some serious drawbacks for them. I'm not going to read out this intro, but you can just read it for yourself. But let's have a look at the national features. So to start off with, yep, they're a race of evil dwarfs. Death scales do not reduce their supply, so you don't have less food available for your armies because of death scales, and they have a halved impact on income. So although you'll be losing your income through the population dying if you take death scales, the actual direct reduction in your income, like your tax income, is halved, which makes death scales a little bit more palatable for them, and possibly something that you would want to select. Their military is made of heavy dwarf infantry, and they really do have very heavy and tough infantry, much like the regular dwarfs. They also have bull centaur sacred cavalry. They're sacred. We'll look at it in a moment. There's the bull centaur down here. They have throngs of expendable slaves, and they have a special mechanic for the way they get their slaves, and they have sneaky hobgoblin servants. So the hobgoblins long ago betrayed the other greenskins. There was during a massive slave uprising against the Chaos Dwarves, and the hobgoblins at the last moment switched sides and helped the Chaos Dwarves win. So the hobgoblins are no longer technically enslaved; they're just servants instead. But yeah, they're basically not very different, but they're hated by all the other greenskins because of it. Their magic is strong fire and earth, which is somewhat similar to the regular dwarfs, but they also have blood and death, which is definitely not something that the regular dwarfs would do. Their sorcerers can succumb to the stone curse over time, and that's a mechanic that I will look at a bit when I'm talking about the various commanders. But this is their drawback. They've learned how to use magic, but their sorcerers, through using magic, suffer from the stone curse and slowly turn to stone. Their priests are powerful. They certainly are. They've got holy threes, and they're basically a theocracy. The sorcerers are also the head of the priesthood of Hashut. They're the main priests of their god. They have extra mechanics. Their armies enslave as they conquer. This is something that the Dark Elves have as well, but that's something that I'll go into once I've looked at the commanders and units and so on. I'll look at the specific mechanics that the nation has, and I'll cover that there. Whenever they own or siege a fort, they pollute the province towards death 1 if it has neutral or positive growth. So if it has death 3 or death 2, so more severe death, this doesn't make any difference. But if it doesn't have that, if it's above death 1, then the pollution from them sieging a fort or from owning a fort will push that scale towards death 1. So definitely something to bear in mind when you're picking your scales is that, let's say you pick growth 3, you're thinking, oh, my capital will build up, I'll get a lot of income, I'll get the population to increase a lot. Well, no, because it'll be pushed back towards death 1 by the pollution that the Chaos Dwarfs produce. The other side of this pollution is that they do have extra resources in their forts because of their kind of factory and industrial processes, and they do start with a grand citadel. Their capital is an absolutely incredible fort. They get the 3 commander points from that really nice capital. It's incredibly hard to siege, and they get a big income and administrative and resource bonus just from having such an efficient and good fort right at the start of the game. Their starting sites are the Temple of Hashut, which gives you 1 death gem per turn and allows you to recruit the Acolyte of Hashut, which is your infantry sacred that can do some missile attacks. The Bull Centaur, which is your kind of cavalry sacred, although they're not true cavalry, they're not mounted. They're similar to the like Pangaean centaurs in that sense. And the Bull Centaur Ancient, which is this absolutely massive Bull Centaur that can work as a kind of a thug and super powerful sacred commander. They have the Forges in the Deep that give them 2 fire and 2 earth per turn, and those enable the recruitment of the Demon Smith, so that's a cap only mage for them, and the recruitment of the Slave Giant, so it's a cap only troop for them. So yeah, income in minor death and then major fire and earth from their cap sites. And they also have the Tower of Zar, which gives them the Immortal, so that's a cap only mundane non-sacred infantry. The recruitment of the Overlord, which is their tier 2 military commander, we'll look at in a moment, and enables the recruitment of the Sorcerer Lords. They have another cap only mage there. So you can see that there is a strong focus on their capital being really important for them. It's very built up. It's got lots of cap only things. So they are vulnerable to the typical tactics that would disrupt a cap only nation. Right, let's talk about the Chaos Dwarf troop lineup. So the very first thing is the Purchase Slave. You can see that this is just an icon. That's because when you buy this troop, you will randomly get a slave troop from a selection, and we can see those by looking at the site. He turns into a random slave once recruited. But let's just look at the cost first. So a little bit of resource cost, 6. It's not nothing, considering that the gold cost is 4. Recruitment points 9. So you need, if you want to have tons of these, you need a province that's got an okay amount of resources and has got a lot of recruitment points. So this is inside forts only, and in order to crank out loads of them, you need like a relatively decent population to get lots of these. And you can see that this, as a placeholder, just doesn't really have any stats at all. But yeah, 4 gold. So, oh, and there is a version of this that you can get outside of forts, which I'll cover in a second. But this one doesn't require there to be a slaver present, whereas the one that is outside of forts, you do need to have a slaver commander present. The one that's outside of forts looks like this. And the reason that this looks different is because if you recruit these outside of a fort and you get a battle in the province on the turn that you recruited them, for that first battle, they won't be in their random slave shape, they'll just be in this default slave shape. So it says here, turns into a random slave once recruited. If the province is attacked before they get a chance to turn into the random slave, you get this orc slave for the duration of that battle. And this orc slave is not a particularly good, it's kind of like an average one for the slaves you'll be able to get. So this is maybe a good starting point to talk about the stats and things that slaves have. They are all slaves, they have halved upkeep, and that's from an upkeep of 4 gold in the first place, so very low upkeep to have slaves. But because the Chaos Dwarves can't rely on the slaves without having guards watching them to do tasks like patrolling, rooting out enemies, things like that, because they'll just run away or rebel if they can, they have -2 their patrol bonus. So if we look at their precision, you can see that their patrol strength is actually -0.5, so they're completely useless for the purposes of patrolling. Do not use them for patrolling whatsoever. They are undisciplined. All of the slaves you can get, I think, are undisciplined. There may be 1 or 2 that aren't, that can actually take orders. And most of them have kind of the similar stats, and they have low protection, not very good morale, and they're slaves. You need a taskmaster to push their morale up. And they don't tend to have very good equipment at all. This one's got no armor whatsoever, and it's got a club. So because they're an orc, they've got a little bit more strength than usual, and they've got some decent hit points. They've got recuperation, so they're a bit tougher than just like a human or something. And many of the slaves you can get are orcs, but they're pretty dismal. for fighting. What you would use these for, since they're also useless for patrolling, is you would use them for siege strength, and you would use them for just absorbing hits in combat, like absorbing lance charges. So if we look in this site here, Chaos Dwarf Slaves, then we can see the full variety of slaves. So you can get Noblars. This is the same Noblars that you get from the Ogre Kingdoms nation, basically, and they've got daggers and flung scrap. You've got Goblin Slaves, and there's one with a pickaxe. There's one with a spiked club, and a buckler, so it's a tiny bit more survivable. One with a spear. These are size 1, the goblins, so they're actually in a way quite nice because you can just cram a lot of them into a square. But if you're using them to absorb lance charges and things like that, in a way it might be worse because they don't take up as much space in the battlefield, so things can get past them more easily. And goblins do have terrible morale, although you can raise it with Taskmaster. And then for the goblins and the orc slaves, there are versions of them that are called war slaves, which are slightly better equipped. So here's one of the goblin war slaves. He's got a short sword, which is a bit better equipment, and he's got a little bit of armor, and his stats are slightly better, I believe. And this is the other goblin war slave, and he's got the same short sword, but he's got a buckler as well. Then we've got orc slaves. There's one with a pickaxe. Pickaxe is not a very good weapon. It has -2 attack, -2 defense, so pretty clumsy. Not really. It's an improvised weapon, but it does do a lot of damage, which can be nice. And there's a slave with no armor and a club. And then there's 2 orc war slaves. One of them has the chopper, which is the distinctive orc weapon that has a charge bonus on first strike, but otherwise it's kind of like a little bit like a falchion or falchion. They have a little bit more armor, so protection 12, that's not terrible for the war slaves. And there's a version of that which has a shield as well. This is definitely one of the best slave soldiers you can get, the orc war slave with a shield. Oh, and their gold cost is actually I told a lie when I said that their upkeep was halved from 4 before. They actually have a shape change that puts them to 1 gold cost. So they actually cost half of 1 gold worth of upkeep in their monthly upkeep cost. So very, very, very low upkeep for the slaves because they don't pay them, basically. They're slaves. You can also get the human slave. Human slaves are actually quite terrible. They have afflictions built in when you get them. They only have a spear. They have dreadful armor and so on, but they're not undisciplined, which means you can actually give them orders. You can separate human slaves out and use them because they will obey orders a little bit more than the greenskins. I believe all the other ones are undisciplined, the goblin slaves and things. So human slaves, they're okay because they're not undisciplined, so you can separate them out from the other slaves and you can put them at the back of the battlefield and maybe just use them to buff your hit points up for the battle and have them hold an attack or something like that, or guard commander, just to keep them out of the way. But as combat units, they're absolutely dreadful. This is because human slaves are quite valuable to the Chaos Dwarves for the purposes of, labor and things like that. Because unlike orcs and goblins, they're a bit less likely to try and eat each other, or they're easier to get them to work through threats of kind of pain and violence and things like that. So they only send the ones that are unable to work properly anymore to the battlefield just to die. Pretty horrible, but there you go. You don't get too many of those, but you get some. And then the rarest type of slave you get, and the best one, is the Ogre Forge Slave, which of course is an ogre, so he's got lots of hit points. He's big and strong. He does eat a lot, but he hits pretty hard. He's got a similar kind of attack. So this is a bit more. It's like a war slave, a bit more able to actually fight the Ogre Forge Slave, and it can be worth grabbing a few of those. They're also not undisciplined because they can obey orders. So yeah, this is what you get for slaves. I would recommend, obviously, don't get them for the purposes of patrolling. Get them to siege offensively. They're not very good at holding up walls because most of them are undisciplined. So they're not very good for siege defense. But for siege offense, they are extremely good value because it's 4 gold, and you can get ones that have siege strength. Let's look at the siege strength of an orc. 1.2 siege strength, which is above average for a human. And they have basically no upkeep. So get them for that, and also get them for just being chaff on the battlefield. Now, you do have a national mechanic that means you're going to get some of these for free, but I'll cover that later. The slaver commander is required to recruit these ones that are recruited outside of forts. So moving on, we have one step up on the social hierarchy from slaves. We have the hobgoblins. The hobgoblins betrayed the other greenskins, and in doing so, got their eternal enmity, but they're also just one step above the slaves, the demonic servants. The Hobgoblin Spearman is your basic, almost like militia unit that you can get as the Chaos Dwarfs. So these guys can patrol. They are stealthy, which can be useful. If you take a stealthy leader, you can move a little group of these around. They have shields. Their protection's no good. They're not particularly good at fighting because of their low strength and low hit points, because Hobgoblins are quite physically weedy, very sneaky, and they've got, okay attack and defense. It's not the worst in the world, it's better than some militia. Um, the spear is not a very good weapon, particularly because they're just not very strong. That 11 piercing damage is not really enough to do much damage. So what do you use Hobgoblin Spearmen for? Well, you use them for patrolling. That's one thing you can use them for until you can replace them with something better. And use them maybe in some stealthy squads just to have some guys to catch arrows with shields. But yeah, generally not a super useful unit, the Hobgoblin Spearmen, I would say, but they are cheap at 7 gold. You can use them for the similar things as you would use the slaves for in terms of siege strength offensively, although they're a much worse deal in terms of gold for siege strength. But you can use them defensively to hold up castle walls as well, so they could be useful for a bit of that. The Hobgoblin Archer costs 1 more gold than the Hobgoblin Spearman, has a little bit less protection, doesn't have a shield, but he does come with a short bow. So you've got 8 gold short bows, and they are stealthy. That's similar to the Atavi, except I think they have worse morale. They do come with Dark Vision 50, which can be useful, but I think worse morale, yeah. And yeah, Hobgoblin Archers, just a cheap way of getting short bows. You definitely have the ability to cast Flaming Arrows, so if you want to do some Flaming Arrow stuff, Hobgoblin Archer is not a terrible choice for that. Possibly in a future version, I might make the Hobgoblins slightly cheaper, but I'm a bit wary of doing that because stealthy troops are very good, and they're not really supposed to be the focus of the nation, getting these Hobgoblins. They're just like an extra thing you can get if you want to. You can get both the Hobgoblin Spearman and the Hobgoblin Archer outside of forts, which can be useful if you just need to get a few more troops quickly. And you can recruit their leaders outside of forts as well, Hobgoblin Khans, who have stealthy leadership, so they can lead these guys around. Next up is the Hobgoblin Sneak. So the Hobgoblin Sneak comes in, there's a commander version of it as well, which is basically the same graphic as an assassin, but the Sneak you can recruit as a troop. They're not very expensive. They're only 11 gold. They don't have very good protection. Their stats are not very impressive at all. And they have very little going for them, except for the fact they are stealthy. They're actually quite stealthy at stealthy 60. And they ambidextrously use these 2 Git knives. Git knives, these short little knives here. But the crucial thing about Git knives is that they have some weak poison built in. So if you are able to hit and do some damage to things that don't have the best armor, you've got a unit here that's got some poison built in. Now, I think I haven't tested the Hobgoblin Sneaks a huge amount. I would say for 11 gold, not worth recruiting at the moment. I think I may have overpriced them somewhat. So I think in a future version, what I'm going to do is either make them cheaper, or I might do what I did with the Hobgoblin Nasty Skulkers, the Goblin Nasty Skulkers in the Greenskins mod, which is to give them armor-piercing weapons, and then have them armor-piercing but very low damage, but then you can use them to get poison or do things that have very good armor, and that would represent that they can just slide these knives in between the armor of various things. They're very skilled at doing that because they're basically very, very well-known backstabbers. But for the moment, I would say Hobgoblin Sneaks, not hugely worth it. You can mass them because they're low in resource cost. They cost a few recruitment points, 12, the kind of standard for a unit that's not as very good is 9, but yeah, 11 gold is maybe just too much to pay for this. The problem is that this 10 damage that you need in order to get the weak poison inflicted, the weak poison itself is not super exciting, it's only 5 poison damage. But the real problem is this 10 damage probably isn't enough to get through protection, and they're not terribly accurate, even though they get 2 attacks each of them, so that's 6 attacks per square. Attack skill 10, yeah, they get +1 on the Git Knife, but 2 attacks at 11, not terribly accurate. You're not going to hit with a huge number of hits. Things that have low protection tend to have higher defense, and when you do hit, a lot of the time it's just not going to get through their armor because it's such low damage. So that's the somewhat underwhelming Hobgoblin troops, which I think could maybe do with a bit of a review. The slaves, which can be very useful. And now we're moving on to the real Chaos Dwarf troops. Chaos Dwarves in general are very expensive. So you can see here their baseline warrior is 16 gold, which is quite pricey, but they have excellent protection, protection 18. They have built-in enhanced magic resistance. It's not as good as the regular dwarfs because they've given up a bit of their magical resistance to use magic, basically, and become a little bit more corrupted by chaos. But 11's better than the usual magic resistance you would see. They've got 13 morale as their base, which is very solid to build off. They have built-in castle defense bonus and built-in siege bonus. This is just like the dwarf troops. Dwarfs also are good at this, particularly good at holding castles. So for 16 gold, if you want somebody to hold up the walls in sieges, they have a siege defense of 1.6. The normal you would get for about 10 gold, 8, 9, 10 gold would be siege defense 0.5 from a human. So in terms of a gold investment for just holding up the walls, they're pretty great at that, to be honest. They have very nice equipment indeed. We've already looked at their protection 18, but here's their pretty good armor. It's not terribly encumbering, or it doesn't have much of a defense penalty involved in it, and they come with a shield. They don't have terribly good basic defense to start off with. It's only 10, so they only end up with defense skill 12, even with that shield. Their attack skill is 11, but then they've got +1 on their Chaos Dwarf axe, and it hits pretty hard. So we've got a 12 attack, single attack being output by them, but it hits pretty hard at 19. That's quite good. And it's a very durable unit indeed. They've got 13 hit points, 18 protection, and I believe their base encumbrance is 2 instead of the base encumbrance of 3, so they don't get terribly tired. So these are great line holders. That's what they're for. They can and will kill things with their axes, but against things with higher defense or very high protection, they're really going to struggle to do that much. So they're kind of line holders, and you also can use them to defend castles. They have Gluttony 1, but that doesn't mean that they eat more than a normal unit. It's because they have Need Not Eat, because Chaos Dwarves can just choose to not eat anything. They can eat like rocks and things like that. They're a little bit sustained by that instead of by real food, but given the opportunity, they will eat real food. So you don't really see these guys suffering from starvation ever, even if there's not enough food to satisfy their gluttony, but they will eat it and then other things will starve instead of them. I would say a very useful all-round unit, worth having at least some of them to just hold up walls and to be kind of line defenders. Although in Dominions you typically want to just get more elite troops, and they're certainly not elite. They're kind of 16 gold is quite a lot to pay for something that isn't really elite, isn't going to be doing a lot of killing. But yeah, I would say well worth buying as a kind of a line holder and wall holder upper. Then we've got the Chaos Dwarf Crossbowman. He has the very similar base stats and the like. He has the same cast defense bonus and siege bonus, so generally useful for that. He costs the same gold at gold 16. He is much less of a melee fighter. He has lower protection because of his worse equipment. Although that does mean that he costs, I believe, less in resources. Let's have a look. Yeah, tiny bit less in resources, same number of recruitment points. So you can see that even though they're a bit expensive in gold, their resource cost is still higher. So that's usually going to be the bottleneck. And you've got recruitment points being quite a bit higher, so that will also be a bit of a bottleneck. That's also something that might encourage you to have order scales. I think the really nice thing about the Chaos Dwarf Crossbowman is that he's okay in melee. For a crossbowman, we're talking about pretty good protection, and we're talking about an okay melee weapon in the form of the hatchet. Hatchets are not too bad. It's not a massive amount of damage. It's only length 1, but you do get attack 1, so it's kind of like a worse version of something like a broadsword. So the hatchet's pretty decent, but the Chaos Dwarf crossbow really is nice. So over a normal crossbow, we have extra damage, we have extra range, extra precision. So it's very similar to the Agarthan's steel crossbows, which are a real feature for them as well. I would definitely have some of these. If you've got enemies that crossbows are good against, so they don't have shields, or their protection is kind of like in the upper mid region. If you're going to do flaming arrows, flaming dwarf crossbows or Chaos Dwarf crossbows are very nice, although flaming shortbows is probably the direction you're going to go instead. Yeah, worth having, 16 gold each. One of the nice things is that a lot of the Chaos Dwarf troops have nice big shields and plenty of protection, so friendly fire it tends to be a little bit less of an issue. Plus, Chaos Dwarves are, of course, very foot slow, being dwarfs. And then we move on to a much more iconic and dangerous missile weapon that the Chaos Dwarfs can field, the Chaos Dwarf Blunderbuss. So Chaos Dwarf Blunderbusses, they're not recruitment limited, which is something that I might change for a future version, just to stop people from massing gigantic walls of them. But they do cost a lot of recruitment points. They cost 28, whereas the crossbows are only 21, so quite intensive to train these guys. 30 resources, again, quite a lot of resources, and 20 gold, that's 4 more than the crossbowman and axeman. They've got the same base stats as the others. They've got the hatchet and they've got the hatchet rather of the crossbowmen, but then they have the same heavier armor that is used by the axemen, so they're a bit more able to stand on the front lines, which is just as well because they have a pretty short-ranged missile weapon in the form of the blunderbuss. Blunderbuss is armor piercing and damage 6, so it's kind of like a weaker crossbow, but it keeps the armor piercing. Doesn't add any strength, whereas the crossbow adds a little bit of strength. Crucially, fires out a ridiculous number of attacks, and it can fire 5 times, and it fires every single turn, not every other turn. So we are talking about a massive, absolutely shredding amount of fire coming out of these. If you compare them with crossbows, they are firing roughly 16 times as fast in terms of the sheer amount of projectiles they're putting out. So really a terrifying amount of fire coming out of them. The fact that it's only 6 damage and armor piercing means that if the opponent has very heavy armor, let's say they've got protection 18, then of course you're not going to be doing that much damage to them. You will still damage them sometimes. You know, if you halve 18, you get 9 protection and you're doing 6 against 9, so sometimes you will outroll them and do a bit of damage to them, some chip damage, but it's not terribly reliable. But if the opponent has lower protection, let's say they've got 10 protection, you know, not very good armor, then that's halved down to 5. So then you're guaranteed to do damage, and you're going to be getting in quite a bit because you're going to be hitting them a lot with the blunderbusses. So although the blunderbuss is armor piercing, it's best to think of it as being something used to shred lighter armor things that perhaps rely on their defense. Of course, it's not so good if they have shields because more of the, you know, they get the full shield parry against all these attacks. But yeah, if you use blunderbusses, some people like to use them in their expansion forces. I would say they can be pretty good in their expansion forces because indie troops don't tend to have that much protection. You can put some Chaos Dwarf blunderbusses behind your Chaos Dwarfs with their shields, and they will just sit behind them and blast over the top of those blunderbusses and kill a huge number of things. I think they're very strong and definitely worth having, and they're kind of a reason that you want to have lots of resources as early as you can to get a bunch of blunderbusses onto the battlefield. Once they get into melee, they're definitely overpriced for what they can do. But so yeah, put them as a second line. You can have like a line of them and then a line of axemen or something like that in front of them, or even just slaves. Although you will completely shred your slaves if you start firing blunderbusses while they're in combat. Moving on, we get the first of the kind of more elite melee units that the Chaos Dwarfs can field, and that is the Infernal Guard. So Infernal Guard need to have a Demon Smith present to recruit them, which is a little bit of a restriction, although Demon Smiths you'll want to have several of anyway. So basically you just have a Demon Smith at any fort where you want to be cracking out Infernal Guard. You only need one there, and the Demon Smiths give you bonus resources, which can help with their extremely high resource cost. 41 resource cost, 21 recruitment points, which is the same as the basic axeman. So it's worth thinking of the Infernal Guard as basically being like an upgrade on the Chaos Dwarf Warrior. So what the Infernal Guard has going for it is extremely high protection. They have the Infernal Full Plate, which is crazy protection, 23 protection. They're basically sealed into extremely high quality plate armor. They also have a full helmet instead of a half helmet, and yeah, just really, really great protection overall, 23. They also have extremely good morale. This is 18 instead of 13. These are guys who basically are completely committed to dying in battle to remove a shame that they've suffered. Kind of similar to Troll Slayers. I think in a future version I may knock this down a bit because I think 18 is a little bit extreme. It should be maybe more like 16, a significantly increased amount over the Chaos Dwarf Warriors, but not that much. Like they're not that fanatical, even though in theory, you know, they're very dedicated to dying in combat. That's maybe not in practice what they'll always do. They gain some survivals, they get Wasteland Survival added on, and they get fire resistance built in. Fire resistance of 5 is pretty nice for a troop. It's nice to have fire resistant things, but particularly so because it stacks very well with their protection, and fire tends to be kind of mid-level damage armor piercing, which means that since it's not armor negating, you will be able to stack your protection and your fire resistance and come through unscathed from almost any fire attack. If you hit these guys with like a falling fires, it'll do basically nothing to them because of their very high protection, their fire resistance, and of course they've got decent hit points as well at 14. They also hit harder than the Chaos Dwarf infantry, the warriors. They do cost quite a bit more. It's not twice as much, but 26 is an additional 10 gold for each of them over 16. If you just need people to like stand up and hold walls up and sit against sieges and stand in front of the enemy and not die against things that don't hit super hard, I think I would prefer to just have more of the Chaos Dwarf warriors. But the Infernal Guard, if you're fighting things that don't hit hard enough to really overcome this protection, are almost invincible. They'll really just sit there and completely tank everything the enemy can throw at them. So very, very strong for those purposes, and they hit very hard. And it's attack 12, so they're just as able to hit things as the warriors. So I have seen people recruit these exclusively over the warriors. I think it is worth using the warriors in some cases, but perhaps a slight preference in general for having Infernal Guard when you've got the resources to do so. But yeah, that's a real feature of the nation, that you can field such incredibly high protection troops. Speaking of incredibly high protection troops, we are onto a true elite unit here, the Immortal, which can only be recruited in the capital. And the Immortal is a combination of very high protection. It's almost as high as the Infernal Guard. It's not quite as high, but they do have better stats. They have a better shield in the form of a kite shield. So they are, I think, in reality, more likely to survive unless they're getting hit by fire attacks. They're more likely to survive than the Infernal Guard. Immortals also have halved gold upkeep because they are like a semi-sacred cast. They don't actually have the sacred ability, but they've got the same upkeep reduction as sacreds, basically. But their starting gold cost is a lot higher. So resource cost very similar to the Infernal Guard. Recruitment point cost is considerably higher than the Infernal Guard. Their gold cost is considerably higher than the Infernal Guard. These guys are more expensive than having 2 Chaos Dwarf warriors. So if you want people to just hold the enemy in place while using evocations or missile weapons, I would consider using 2 Chaos Dwarf warriors instead. However, the Immortals do have all of the same racial benefits. They've got the same survivals and everything, but then they also have Bodyguard too, which can be useful because you've got some very expensive mages, and yeah, you've got very expensive mages, and so having something with the Bodyguard ability is very nice. Yeah, super elite unit, but very expensive. So I would say that they're kind of for a specialized purpose. If you need something that can stay in the fight, has excellent morale, obviously not as good as the Infernals, but I possibly will be moving the Infernals morale down a bit, I think. They've got the same higher magic resistance the Infernals have. Not quite as much protection, they don't have the fire resistance, but they are better hitters. They come with a better weapon, the Mastercrafted Axe, which is very nice and hits very hard. They do an extra 1 point of damage over the Infernals. They can just hit harder, they are more accurate. They attack with 13 instead of attacking with 12. And yeah, very, very solid elite unit. You're just not going to have that many of them. It's basically the problem with Immortals. They're hard to mass, they're expensive. So yeah, a small group of these though can really beat stuff up. They can fight enemy elites pretty well too because they're able to overcome high defense to some extent because of their decent attack and very strong protection. Yeah, so I think worth building, and in Dominions generally elite units tend to be very strong, even elite infantry. Then we've got another capital only, the Acolyte of Hashut. So Acolytes of Hashut are a sacred. This is your sacred infantry unit. They have the same kind of stats as the racial stats as the Chaos Dwarf generally have. They don't have the Wasteland survival because they're used to kind of living in cities a bit more. They do have some fire resistance built in. It's not terribly strong. It's not as strong as the Infernal Guard. As an infantry unit, if you were just looking at this and going, okay, this is 35 gold in a lot of recruitment points and a sacred, the stats are not great. It has, for Chaos Dwarfs, protection 16 is kind of low. That's basically what their crossbowmen have. They've got the same, good magic resistance and good morale, but it's not amazing morale considering they're sacred. So what is good about the Acolytes of Hashut, apart from just the fact that they're sacred? Well, basically they've got 2 things going for them. The first is that they have a glaive. Now the glaive is not a super accurate weapon. It has this decreased attack, but it is length 3, which is nice to have because you can avoid being repelled. And the Chaos Dwarves do suffer a bit from repel, even though they've got really good morale, because their defense skill is typically quite bad, which means they do end up getting pushed away by enemy weapons quite a bit. But Length 3 can help you get around that, and it does hit super hard. 23 damage is a great starting point of damage. If you can upgrade their attack skill, then you've got with the blast, then you've got something that can attack very accurately and hit very hard because of the glaive. And then the real feature of them is they have this Flames of Hashut missile attack. So the Flames of Hashut, it is -1 damage, but you get to add strength to it, and it's armor piercing. You get 2 projectiles every single turn. You get 10 ammunition, which is a decent quantity of ammunition. 30 range, which is pretty good. I believe 30 range is shortbow range. Let's have a look. Shortbows are range 35, so it's slightly shorter range than a shortbow, but still pretty good range. It's magic, which is always nice to have, magic and fire damage. If the enemy has lots of fire resistance, then this is not going to be so good. But 10 armor piercing damage, 2 attacks per round, if you think of that compared to a crossbow. So if you look at the Chaos Dwarf crossbow, we're talking about 13, but that's every other round, as opposed to something that fires 4 times as many projectiles in the same amount of time. So over 2 turns, this fires 4 projectiles. Over 2 rounds, the crossbow fires 1. But yeah, lower damage, but it's armor piercing. It's very strength based. So if you get strength of giants on them, it scales directly up. If you give them +5 strength, that goes up to 15 armor piercing fire damage on the Flames of Hashut. So with the right blesses, this actually can be quite good. They can be quite a nice mid-ranged missile weapon, which is magic. So you can hit ethereal things with it. You can hit things that have invulnerability, stuff like that, and are only resistant to mundane weapons. And if you increase their strength, which you can do very easily with blesses, because you can give them strength through blood, for instance, or through blood rush if they do manage to kill things, then you can end up with a very nasty ranged weapon. So I would say worth considering taking a bless for them. They're not very aggressively costed for sacreds. 35 gold is quite expensive, really, for what you're getting here, but they're quite versatile and they can perform surprisingly well. With a strong bless, definitely worth having lots of them. Moving on to another unit, this time not sacred, that can absolutely shred large numbers of enemy units, very similar to the Acolytes of Hashut and the Blunderbusses, is the Fireglaive. So Fireglaves are limited recruitment, you can only get 5 per turn, but also they're very expensive in gold resources, and I believe their rec cost is around 30. I can't remember exactly, but it's around that much. They're basically, if you take an Infernal Guard, so you've got the Infernal Guard armor and everything, and the fire resistance built in, but then you took away their shield, you took away their axe, and instead they have a polearm, which is length 3, so you can avoid some of the problems with repels that you suffer. It doesn't hit super hard, it's not like a halberd or anything in terms of how hard it hits, but 23 is still pretty good. And then when the Fireglaive swings, so it doesn't need to hit in order to get this, you get the Fireglaive Gout, which is Air Effect 2, so this can hit 2 enemy squares. It can also hit 1 enemy square and the square that you're in. That's something that sometimes happens with it. So something to be aware of is that you'll hit yourself with it. But it's armor piercing magic fire damage of 6. The strength of the wielder is not added, so think of that as being like similar to the Blunderbuss. The Blunderbuss is firing was it 8 shots, I believe? Yeah, 8 shots from a blunderbuss every round. Fireglaive, it could be hitting 2 enemy squares, so it could be hitting 6 enemy units, for instance, and doing 6 armor piercing damage to each of them. So similarly able to just absolutely shred things that don't have the best armor. It falls off very hard if they have fire resistance. I will say that because it's such a low amount of damage being output in the first place, even though it's spread over a large area, if they have fire resistance, it's not going to do much. This is, of course, why the Infernal Fireglaive doesn't worry about hitting itself. It has fire resistance and it has really high protection, so it will never really hurt itself by doing that. But it could hit friendly slaves and the like. They require a Demon Smith present to recruit because they're like Infernal Guard. These were too strong, but I have made them a bit weaker and I've put a recruitment limit on them. But before, this was the unit that everyone just recruited as many of as they could. I would say it's still very good, but if the enemy is using units that are very high protection or they have fire resistance, this falls off quite quickly because you're not going to get that many hits with the actual main weapon itself, the Fireglaive, do that high damage. So a lot of the time you'll just be relying on the fire to hit things, and if they have very high protection or fire resistance, it's just not going to do that much. If they don't know, it's fantastic. It's fantastic against swarms. It's fantastic against masses of enemy troops like Skaven or Orcs and Goblins would be fielding. It can absolutely roast through things. It can shred independent troops, absolutely. And they're incredibly tough with their 23 protection, just like the Infernal Guard. But also with a little bit of repel sometimes if the enemy has shorter weapons, so very, very hardy indeed, but expensive and limited. Next we have another sacred, the Bull Centaur. So bull centaurs are the best way to think of these is that they're very similar to the white centaurs that Pangaea has. They have some advantages over the white centaurs and they have some disadvantages. They're not mounted units, just like the centaurs are not mounted units. So they don't have that big extra bunch of defense skill because they don't have the extra ability against harassment to reduce harassment penalties. They don't have the built-in +3 that mounted units have. So the defense skill is actually not that exciting and they don't have any shields. So they will get hit, but very high hit points indeed at 27. For a size 3 unit, 27 hit points, pretty great. Very nice protection, much higher than the white centaurs and things like that have, 17. They've got nice built-in magic resistance. They're pretty quick. Their map move is good. Chaos Dwarfs tend to have pretty bad combat speed. You can see combat speed 6 here is very common. They're basically all set to be like combat speed 6. They don't I've tweaked their combat speed so that even if they're wearing heavier armor, they tend to be about the same combat speed because dwarfs like to march in lockstep. Dwarfs do tend to have good map move. 12 is pretty good for this kind of heavy infantry that they often have. But these guys put them to shame with 20 map move, and they're very fast in combat, 24 combat speed. They can really just run along the flanks and absolutely wallop things. They've got the same kind of built-in bonuses, but yeah, bull centaurs are sacred. I'm not quite sure why I've said requires a temple to recruit. Obviously, it requires a temple to recruit because it's sacred. So I'm not quite sure why I wrote that, but it is true. It's the same as the Acolyte of Pashat. Possibly in a previous version they weren't sacred. I might remove that just because it might cause some confusion. But yeah, when we're looking at the Bull Centaur, the important thing is you can look at it as a blessed chassis, and it has a lot of the things that you want to see in a blessed chassis. In that it already has a built-in very hard hit. It has 2 attacks already. It has nice stats. Has high hit points. It has protection. If you push up any of these things, if you push up the strength, they turn into incredibly hard-hitting units. If you push up the protection, they become almost impossible to hurt for normal things. If you enlarge them, put the hit points even higher, or get regeneration on them, they become very, very tough. So they take a bless extremely well. You can put them on the flanks, and they will really perform, I think, better than their stats would indicate because they're just good in so many different categories. Their encumbrance isn't terribly high, so they tend to not really get tired in battle either. So yeah, Bull Centaur is very strong. I would say more important to take these as your main consideration when you're taking a bless along with your mages rather than the acolytes. I think Bull Centaurs are better. But yeah, they're also capital only, so both of your sacreds are capital only, and that's worth bearing in mind. But yeah, look at this hit. 26 damage Chaos Dwarf Battle Axe hit. Oh, very, very nice indeed. Then we have a somewhat specialized Infernal unit, the Infernal Chosen. So this is the kind of champion amongst the Infernals. And the crucial thing about the Infernal Chosen, apart from it just having really good stats, is that so it doesn't come with a shield. It does have the same amazing armor that they tend to have. It requires a Demon Smith present to recruit, so very similar to the Infernals in a lot of way. But the absolute crucial thing about it is that it has 2 of these Forge Axes. Forge Axes have a fire attack that if they manage to do damage, you'll get this. So it's an extra 12 magic fire armor piercing damage. That's only if you do damage though. But crucially, this is a magic weapon itself. So if the enemy doesn't have fire resistance, this is very frightening. But also, if you just need something with magic attacks, then you've got access to a melee unit that has accurate and high damage magic attacks in the form of the Infernal Chosen. I think that is worth noting and worth considering because ethereality can be such a problem, invulnerability can be such a problem for so many units, mist form can be such a problem, and this can chop through all of those. They are very expensive though, at 60 gold. They do require a lot of resources because you've got to make these Forge Axes for them, and their limited recruitment is just 1 per turn. I would say get some of these out and basically just put them in with your Infernal Guard. If you're recruiting ordinary Infernal Guard, they're great in there. They can go in great with Immortals. They can even be mixed in with Chaos Dwarf Warriors, and they perform just fine. Of course, you don't want to put them with the missile units, but they can go with all of the melee units, and they perform really well. They're a little bit of a vanity kind of glamour unit, costing 60 gold and not being sacred. I think something that I might do with these guys just to encourage the recruitment of, 1 a turn now and then at least, is I might give them halved upkeep. But I'm going to keep my eye on them, review them, because having a unit that is got 2 magical attacks is just so useful as a built-in thing. So yeah, let me know how you get along with Infernal Chosen, but I suspect they're currently worth it as kind of a specialist or niche unit. Then we've just got 2 more units to look at. I'm going to look at this one at the end first, which is the Hobgoblin Wolf Rider. This can be recruited in all non-fort provinces. You don't need a slave master or anything like that to have them. You can just recruit them anywhere you want. These guys are basically light missile cavalry. Their morale is terrible. However, they do come with a bunch of useful special abilities. So firstly, they've got pretty good defense skill, including their shield. Their protection is not good, but they are cheap. 20 gold each. You can use them for flanking attacks because they're very fast, they've got good map move, they are stealthy, which means you can send them off on stealthy raids, so you could potentially have your Hobgoblin Khan leading off a bunch of Hobgoblin Wolf Riders, and they can do okay against province defense, to be honest. I don't know that it's the best use of your gold, but you can do raiding parties with these. They'll perform probably better than the Hobgoblin mainline units. And you can also hold an attack and they'll get off some shots with their short bows first. They have 2 attacks in combat, so they are, capable of putting out plenty of attacks and doing some damage. Their problem, like basically all of the other Hobgoblin units, is they just don't do very much damage. So the Light Lance does get a charge bonus on that very first strike, but it's built-in damage with the Hobgoblin's low strength. It just doesn't do that much damage. I think something that I'm going to consider is maybe just putting Hobgoblins up to strength 9. That would still make them weaker than a normal human, but maybe just that little bit of extra strength will allow them to do a bit more. Let me just check actually, as a matter of interest. How much is a goblin? So goblins are at 7, so they are stronger than goblins, but yeah, maybe they need to be at strength 9. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it, or they may just need to be cheaper. But I would say that the Hobgoblin Wolf Rider is usable for 20 gold. They're okay patrollers. You can see there that their patrol strength is not too bad for 20 gold. It's not something that I would want to do long term. If you're trying to do kind of like a blood economy type thing, you'd want to get people that don't cost as much upkeep. But they do come with the Pillager ability, which is nice because you also do have Pillager on this commander, the Hobgoblin Khan. So you can use them to do some very effective raid commands, which are a little bit of advanced dominions, but some people can do some really cheesy, nasty stuff with that. So yeah, I think I would use these as basically hold and attack rear guys. If I have flaming arrows, I would take that as a little bonus. That if I've got a flaming arrows force, I can fire off all my short bows and things, but I can also have some of these guys doing hold and attack rear, and they'll be able to fire off a couple of rounds with their flaming arrows and then go and pick people off as they retreat or try and kill mages. They are very, very fast. They can be good for killing mages. Then finally, we have the big dumb giant. So this graphic only appears in the recruitment screen. When you recruit them, you then get the full-sized giant standing there majestically with its big swinging chains. I think I talked about the giants quite a bit in the Ogre National Overview, but basically, giants are super tough, super high hit points. However, they are very, very expensive at 240 gold. These hit points combined with not amazing protection means that if they get into contact with a load of enemy infantry, they'll actually get chopped up and die very quickly. So you have to be very careful with them, put buffs on them to use them. Or if you've got their positioning right, they do have some great benefits, which is they come with fear, which is very strong in a recruitable unit, and they hit ridiculously hard. So heavy chains, you wouldn't like just looking at this, you go like, okay, so they've got this very long weapon, the heavy chain. So it's they could maybe get some repels with that because it's so long, and it's good that they don't get repels. But like, okay, 25 damage, but they're not going to hit things that often. Well, it's got area effect too, so you are going to hit things. You're guaranteed to hit things. And if the enemy's relying on things that have very high defense, like if you're looking at elves in Warhammer or in the Dominion's base nations, things that people call elves, like Vanheers, things like that. They rely on having glamour and super high defense and stuff like that, and cavalry, that are very expensive and have very high defense and they don't suffer harassment penalties and blah blah blah, or they have very high protection. Well, the heavy chains are just going to blow through that protection because of their super high damage, and they're going to totally ignore their defense because their area effect. So if you can land these on expensive enemy units that rely on their protection and defense and don't have huge amounts of hit points themselves, the slave giant can absolutely make up its cost by just obliterating a couple of squares of enemies every turn. You've also got the Giant Stomp, which it doesn't work so well on large or strong beings. It has area effect 1, so it's just another area effect attack. Now, like I mentioned with the Fire Gout off the Infernal Fireglaive earlier, so if we were looking at this, this also has Air Effect too, and I mentioned that you can hit yourself with it, and that is true with the Slave Giants, they can hit themselves. And if they hit themselves, they will do a lot of damage because they don't have that much protection, particularly on the body. They don't have it. If you look at their body protection, it's only 10, head protection 26. They're not going to get hit in the head much. This is basically just to stop them, keep them under control, this big, heavy, like iron helmet on top of them, and stop them from eating other slaves or eating Chaos Dwarfs. But yeah, only 10 body protection, which means if they hit themselves, they're going to do a huge amount of damage to themselves. And they will sometimes hit themselves because Air Effect 2 means that that can spill over onto the square that you're standing in. So they're quite difficult to use. I think if I continue to see people are just not really able to make use of them and get their golds cost out of slave giants, then I'm going to reduce them in golds cost further. But they do at least give you this like specialized counter to certain types of units, and if you can get them in the right place, put some buffs on them, or keep them alive, keep your own troops surrounding them and keep them safe, then having a recruitable unit with fear is very nice early on for making people run away. I definitely wouldn't try and use them for expansion against independents, but I would use them if I wanted to, say, counter an enemy god that's relying on high defense or repel or something, and they just can hit them very hard. I would maybe use them against elite sacred enemies, things like that they can just blast. And I would use them if I was willing to kind of do the sweaty work of getting their positioning exactly right, even though they're undisciplined in battle. So that's everything for the troops, and I think I'll move on to talking about commanders next. I actually recorded that first bit of the video about the troops, the introduction and everything quite a while ago, and in the meantime I've looked at some of the costs and decided to make some changes to the Chaos Dwarfs. So let me just cover the changes to the troops now, go through those. The first thing is that the Hobgoblin Sneak, who previously was pretty weak, I felt, I've changed their Git Knives so that they now have armor piercing damage. They do a bit less damage, but it's now armor piercing, which should give them more of a niche they can work in, and they can be more useful against things that have very high armor. You could nip in with the Git Knives, get some damage in there. 8 armor piercing damage is enough to reliably get some damage in, and then you can rely on the poison doing a bit more. So I've improved the Hobgoblin Sneaks. I've made the Hobgoblin Spearmen cost 1 gold less, and the same is true of the Hobgoblin Archer. They cost a bit less gold because I felt they were overpriced for what you got before. I have done the same for the Chaos Dwarf Warrior. He used to be 16 gold, now he's 15 gold, so hopefully they're slightly more attractive than they were. You still have to pay 16 for the crossbowman though. I have slightly increased the cost on the Infernal Full Plate, this piece of armor here, in terms of resources. So it costs more resources, which means that these are a bit harder to mass now, the Infernal Guard, and it makes these a bit more attractive because they're 25 resources for a Chaos Dwarf Warrior, rather than just going straight to the Infernal Guard, who are 45 resources and of course very expensive. But you do get fantastic protection still, I didn't change that. I also thought that the Infernal Chosen was a bit underpowered, so the Infernal Chosen has been reduced in gold from 60 to 50, and he has now got halved gold upkeep permanently because they're a sort of semi-sacred in a way. Well, sort of a profane sacred, I suppose. Finally, similar to the Hobgoblin and Chaos Dwarf Warrior changes, but probably more important, I changed the Purchase Slave recruitment from 4 gold to 3 gold. So they are cheaper now, but they do cost more resources. They used to cost, I think it was 5 or 6 resources, now they're 8 resources. So harder to mass them, a bit more of a resource cost involved, but less gold because many of the slaves are not particularly good. So that's got you up to date with all of the changes as of version 1.6 of the compilation. Now then, let's talk about the commanders you get. So starting off Hobgoblin Scout, you get these, they're recruitable outside of forts, they're 25 gold. It's a scout, there's not much else to say about that, but having recruitable anywhere scouts is nice. The Hobgoblin Gut Stabber. So this is a 1 command point assassin, which is, if anyone has gone through the hell of many assassins attacking them, is pretty significant. However, he's not a very good assassin. So if you are going the route of taking magic items, which you probably will be, to beef up your assassins, giving them like, well, you can't really do water bottles, but potentially if you got water mages you could. But with the Chaos Dwarves you could be doing Amulet of the Dead, so they can just keep creating skeletons each turn. And for that they're great because Sorry, I'm looking at the scat. For that, the Gut Stabber is great because it is not very expensive at 70 gold, although, still something. It's only one command point, so you can have 2 of them in a basic fort, 3 of them in your advanced forts. And yeah, it's not got particularly great stats for an assassin. It has a tendency to run away if it gets hit by anything. It's got various problems, but they can do okay in melee. In theory, you could use these without magic items, but really what they are is a device for carrying a magic item that can win you an assassination battle. There's quite a few of those that are available, and the Chaos Dwarfs are fairly good at making them because they've got a forge bonus, which we will talk about in a bit. Then you've got your Castellan. This is your basic military commander. He's a Chaos Dwarf, so he's pretty good at fighting. Because this is a Warhammer mod nation, of course, he's got the basic bit of unsurroundable and more hit points than you might expect for a humanoid, because the military commanders are a bit buffed up. But other than that, he's just a basic commander. He's got leadership 80. It's good leadership, so he gets +1 squad morale bonus, and he can have 3 squads without any morale bonuses in the first place. So I think they're okay. They're fairly expensive at 70 gold. I don't imagine that you're going to use a huge number of them, especially if you're using independence turned on. I don't think you'd make that many Castellans. Maybe you'd have 1 or 2 throughout an entire game. Then we've got the Death Mask. Death Masks are really a flavor thing. They're not very much worth building. I put them in because they're supposed to be the leaders of the Infernals rather than the Castellans leading them. They're not allowed to lead very many units because they're just the leaders of these small squads. But they do have better stats. They're better at fighting the Castellans. But other than that, pretty similar. They can't lead very many things, so you basically don't want to really use Infernal Deathmask unless you're playing thematically, in which case you can have them lead a small squad of Infernals around. And they require a Demon Smith because they need a Demon Smith for their armor, just like the Infernals do. Next up, we have the Slaver, and Slavers don't use the capture slaves mechanic that some of the Dominions enslaving nations do. Instead, each month in any province that has more than 2,000 population and less than 20 unrest, if there is a slaver present, it will generate 1d3 slave troops. Stacking slavers does not increase the number of slaves, so you want to put a slaver in a province. You don't want to have 10 slavers in one province. You won't get any more slaves that way. But if you can scatter a few of these around, you will get free slaves. It doesn't generate unrest or cause any problems. You can have the slaver themselves doing a bit of patrolling because they've got a patrol bonus, and they give you a resource bonus. So you can use that to pick up more things that are not buildable in forts or something like that, or you can have many slavers stacked in a fort. I don't think it's a great idea, but you could potentially get some more resources in a fort by doing that if it's really necessary for you. They are Taskmaster 3, so they are excellent at leading slaves. They have 50 leadership, but they have bad leadership. So they can only have 1 squad, and there's a squad morale bonus. There's -1. So bad leaders, but they make up for it by being taskmasters, and that means that they can lead groups of slaves around just fine with their 50 leadership. Other than that, I think they're required to. Oh no, I think outside of a fort, if you have the purchase slave, requires the presence of a slaver. Yeah. So if you want to purchase slaves outside of forts, then for 3 gold each, then you need to have a slaver there, and they're going to be generating slaves automatically as well. Is that worth 90 gold? I leave that up to you, dear watcher. I'd like to receive some balance feedback on these, and we can see if people are making use of them. I think they're okay, especially now that I've improved the slaves by making them cheaper. I think they're probably worthwhile to build lots of slaves and things and do patrolling with them. Although actually I should point out that the greenskin slaves, of course, have a patrol bonus of -1, which means they, in fact, if we look at their patrol, -5, yeah, they make your patrols worse. So do not patrol with lots of greenskin slaves led by slavers. That would be a bad idea. But you can use the slaver themselves and any that don't have that negative patrol bonus to do patrolling. Then we've got the first of your mages. It's the Pyrophant. Pyrophants are very low level mages. They have F1, and then they've got a chance of getting F2. 1 in 4 of them will be F2, but the rest of them are F1E1, F1D1, and F1B1. So you can get your blood economy going with these guys. They're okay for that. You can have some that are useful for the purposes of casting Fire 2 stuff. Fire 2 is a pretty decent path for something that only costs 100 gold. It's not the worst thing in the world. The ones with Fire Death, you can do corpse candles and things with, I guess. They're not super useful. Fire Earth is kind of a magma darty guy. This is a workhorse mage. You use it for researching. They're fairly research efficient. If you've got magic scales, which are probably a good idea, I would think, then you can have lots of Pyrophants and get through that. They're sacred, so reduced upkeep. They do have priest level 1, which means that you can use them for preaching, and you can do banishment spam and the like with them. Yeah, not bad little mage, the Pyrophant. It's not terribly exciting, of course. So moving on to the more exciting mages, in any of your forts you can recruit sorcerers. Sorcerers are considerably more expensive. 240 gold is nothing to be sneezed at. This is kind of in the upper tier of a lot of nations, the expense and power of mages that they get. And they have pretty good paths to go with it. So we've got F2, E1, D1 built in. They're a priest level 2, which I know people aren't terribly fond of because it tends to push up the auto calculation gold cost, but I don't use that. I just cost things manually. So if you feel like they are too expensive for what they are, let me know and I will take that into consideration. That's kind of balanced feedback is always welcome. But they come with the same random as the Pyrophants. So you can get these at F3, which is nice enough. It's not super exciting to have things at F3, but it's not too bad. It's good for doing big fire elemental spam with Phoenix Pyre. Oh, sorry, not Phoenix Pyre, Phoenix Power, and then casting the big fire elementals with fire gems. You can get Earth 2 with them, which is nice. You can get Death 2 with them, which is nice. Death 2 and F2 means that you can get to Banefire, which is a superb spell later in the game. So yeah, quite a few things you can do with them. Of course, they've still got that one blood that they can get, but I wouldn't be using the sorcerers to do your blood economy. You should just use Pyrophants for that. They do have one drawback, which you can't see here, or it is referred to here. Each turn, this mage has a chance to be afflicted by the Stone Curse, changing to a form carried by guards, gaining encumbrance and losing their foot slot. So be careful if you are putting Earth Boots on these guys. If you've got an Earth 2 one, you want him at Earth 3, and you've put Earth Boots on him, you're risking that. Every single turn there's a chance that he can lose his foot slot, and that item will just disappear if that happens, so be careful about that. What does the stone form look? Well, you've got the Stone Curse progression site here that tells you what that looks like. So they start off as Stone Cursed Sorcerers. You can see that they are being born on a palanquin by these guys. They have more encumbrance, but they're otherwise basically the same. But for these guys, once they've started to become Stone Curse, you can see he's starting to turn to stone from the feet up. Each turn there's a chance that the Stone Curse will progress, which reduces all non-earth magic paths by 1. So now we're really starting to lose a lot of your magic, further encumbering the mage and removing the chest slot and 1 hand slot. So again, be careful with your boosters. You can see he hasn't got a foot slot, but he's going to lose his chest slot and his hand slot when the Stone Curse progresses. This is because Chaos Dwarves, in their because dwarves are not naturally able to use magic, they've kind of made like a weird bargain with Hashut, Father of Darkness, and they are afflicted by a curse. The use of magic over time basically increases their chance of just turning to stone. And you can see here we've got the Stone Racked Sorcerer. This is the kind of end phase for sorcerers as the Stone Curse progresses. They've got a lot worse magic. And then finally there's a chance the Stone Curse will finally claim them, which kills the mage. So something to bear in mind is that you are going to take some attrition to your sorcerers just from them turning into stone. There's really nothing you can do to mitigate that. Yeah, it's just a chance. It's a thing that happens. If they start to get turned into stone, send them out and use them while they're still alive, or keep them doing useful things, which you want to be doing with your mages anyway. But the main thing is be careful with these slot losses, the foot slot, the hand slot, the body slot that you eventually lose. Because you can lose items, and that is worse than losing the mage a lot of the time. So in a slightly odd order here, we now have the capital-only Overlord. Overlords are your upper tier military commander. They are 2 CP rather than 1 CP. They have very high leadership. This is excellent for leading large armies around. You may want to have some Overlords. I don't think that they're hugely worth building. You can build them if you want. 140 gold is a lot even for something with such great leadership and pretty good fighting skills. Unsurroundable 3 built in, good hit points and everything. The reason that I say that you might not want to build these guys is that you get them whenever you recruit a Sorcerer Lord. You get 1 Overlord for free, which means that you're not paying the CP to get those Overlords, and you probably want to get Sorcerer Lords anyway, so you're going to end up with some free Overlords. But they're there as an option if you want to recruit them on their own. But it is capital only, and capital only turns are fairly constricted. Your next capital only commander is the Bull Centaur Ancient. So these really are quite unusual. Not many nations get things like this. This is a sacred but non-mage, non-priest commander who costs 3 commander points. So in your capital, you'll be able to get one of those a turn because you have 3 CP. Costs quite a few resources, so it can slow down your troop production to be making these, and 200 gold, which is of course a fair whack for something which is not a major tool. However, if you look at the stats, you can see why. They are absolute houses, 70 hit points, 25 strength, so incredibly strong and hard hitting. If you put items on them that make use of their strength, that's going to be fantastic. There's quite a few items which very much care about how much strength the person carrying them has. They come with a built-in Executioner's Axe, which is a very hard-hitting but not magic or particularly exceptional axe, but you can see 41 slash damage coming out of this. They can just obliterate things by whacking them. And they've got 2 additional bonus attacks where they just trample, well not trample, but kick and gore and generally rampage through the enemy, smashing them with these extra attacks. They don't have trample, so they do get to use all their attacks. They've got decent enough armor attached to them, ending them up with 21 protection. So it's a lot of protection, a lot of hit points. They're sacred, of course, so if you've got a bless that synergizes well with this, they can be thugs. Yeah, I would say that don't super kit these guys because it's too much of a risk. They have pretty good magic resistance, but it's not amazing. They could be insta-killed, obviously. Some of their other stats can let them down. They don't have incredible defense or anything like that. They're not mounted because they're kind of centaur-like. But they do have Unsurroundable 2 built into them, which can help them stay alive. And yeah, they can be relied on to hit things very hard and be very tough. And that's primarily what they're there for. They're not particularly good leaders. They're just a basic 40 leader, so don't use them for leading things around. Well, I suppose you could give them some bull centaurs if you wanted to be thematic, but of course they cannot bless the bull centaurs, nor can they bless themselves, so you're going to be wanting to put Pyrophants with them most likely. Next amongst your capital only lineup, and you may have noticed by now a theme, is that you are very cap restricted. The Chaos Dwarfs absolutely love their capital city of Zanagrund and do not particularly care about anything else. The other places they build are basically fortresses and things, which is why they start off with a Grand Citadel but can only build standard forts elsewhere. The Demon Smith. So Demon Smiths have a forge bonus of 1, so half that of an Almish Smith, the same as the Dwarf Smiths for the non-Chaos Dwarfs have, for instance. The same as the Warlock Engineers for the Skaven have. They come with a resource bonus, which can be useful. It's not super significant. It's only, I think, the same resource bonus as the Slaver has, is it? Yeah, 10 resource bonus. So don't recruit them for that, but it is a nice benefit of having some Demon Smiths. They're only 2 CP, so you can get more than 1 a turn out from your capital. You can get 1.5 out effectively. And they have Master Smith, which means that they can smith as if they had 1 extra in each of the paths they do have. So you can, in theory, empower one of these. Let's say that you wanted to get Astral on them to do some Astral smithing. If you give them, empower them into Astral 1, then they can smith as if they were Astral 2. So that can be useful. But yeah, their magical paths are Fire 1, Earth 1, and then they have this random. So you can smith as if you were Earth 3 in theory. You can smith as if you were Fire 3, getting these, if you get the right randoms. You can smith as if you were Death 2 and Blood 2. So it opens up quite a few things for you in terms of smithing. It's nice to have the discount. They're sacred, so their upkeep isn't particularly high, but they're not priests themselves. And of course, you need a Demon Smith present. You need to make this in your capital and then send it out to another fort in order to recruit Infernal Guard. So you will be making some Demon Smiths for the purposes of doing that. And they are pretty useful, generally speaking. I also really like their graphic. I think I did a good job there. So that's the Demon Smith. Don't use them as combat casters. Use them for forging and for enabling these other things, and maybe for doing some research, just because they're going to be sitting around doing that. But yeah, forging lots of low-level items is good once you get a Dwarven Hammer on them, which of course you can fairly easily get as the Chaos Dwarfs. So here is another capital-only commander. The Sorcerer Lord is the pinnacle of your commander recruits. Of course, as I mentioned, you get a free Overlord when you recruit one of these. They are very expensive at 430 gold, but bear in mind you are getting a free Overlord. It says here, when you recruit this commander, you will get a free Overlord. It's factored into the recruitment cost. The upkeep cost is accordingly decreased, so you're not paying the full upkeep for a 430, but you are paying the upkeep on the Overlord as well. So, what do you get for your 430 gold? Well, you get an Overlord and you get a Sorcerer Lord who has F2, E2, D1, Blood 1, and he then has a 10% chance, so this is not terribly relevant, but he has the same random that the others have. So here you can get up to Earth 3, With Earth Boots, of course, you can get to Earth 4. You can get up to Fire 3. You can get up to Blood 2. You can get up to Death 2. You could get up to one of the other paths, but honestly, you're not going to have enough of them because this is 6 recruitment points. 6 recruitment points is the cost of extremely expensive, extremely powerful and rare commanders and dominions. But here it's more a function of the fact that you also get an Overlord when you recruit a Sorcerer Lord. So you will be wanting to recruit some of these. You will get Overlords through doing it. You do want these very nice paths. You're not going to have a lot of Sorcerer Lords. Do bear in mind that your capital gives you 3 commander points a turn. So this is basically like a 4.1 in another nation. It's a slow to recruit. It takes 2 turns to get one. They have Priest level 3. Which means that you do have another thing here that can go and claim thrones. You can get Divine Blessing, and you can do the other good stuff that is involved with that. I think Sorcerer Lords are well worth recruiting. It's really painful if you lose one, and it's definitely worth bearing in mind that they are also afflicted by the Stone Curse. So they're very similar to the Sorcerers, however they have one extra phase in their Stone Curse. So they have the same first phase of the Stone Curse, which is they lose their foot slot and they get carried around by guys. Let's go and have a look. Where the Sorcerer is carried around by basic warriors because they're not so important, the Sorcerer Lords are very important in Chaos Dwarf society. They're at the pinnacle, basically, and so they get carried around by Immortals. So they actually have kind of an interesting set of attacks from the Immortal Bearers, just hacking stuff up there, and they end up with pretty good stats and protection and stuff. But you really don't want this to happen. It's bad. It slows down your Sorcerer Lord. And then they lose their foot slot at first, which is bad, of course, Earth Boots being very important to you. And then you've got the same problem each turn. There's a chance it can progress, which reduces all their paths by 1, which is, of course, very bad. And they get further encumbered. They lose their chest slot and 1 hand slot. So they turn to Stone-Racked Sorcerer Lords, so we can see here. But then their next step of progression, instead of just dying, they turn into a statue being carried around. They lose all of their magic, but they can still be carried around by the Immortal Guards, and the Sorcerer Lord statue is Holy 3. So they never lose that Holy 3, no matter what happens to them. Even after they've been turned into stone, they still have Holy 3. So you can still have these guys walking around, casting Banishment Spam, smiting, and claiming thrones. So take your Sorcerer Lord statues around to claim thrones and do preaching and things like that, basically. They're an 8-caster. Because they're a statue being carried around by a couple of guys, and their stats are pretty good because it represents the guys rather than the sorcerer at this point. You know, more hit points, get better protection, and so on. So those are your capital only recruits, and then we have one recruit absolutely anywhere commander. Oh, sorry, he can't be recruited in forts. So you've got the scout that can be recruited in forts and outside forts, and then you've got the Khan, Hobgoblin Khan, which can only be recruited in non-fort provinces. The Khan is a stealthy cavalry leader. He is not a particularly good leader, but you can get him anywhere, of course. 1 recruitment point, 70 gold. Possibly a bit overpriced. I guess we'll see. He potentially could be a bit cheaper, but it's a way of just getting some leadership out there, and you can use them to lead around Wolf Riders, and they can go off and do stealthy raiding for you. I don't necessarily recommend trying to do stealthy raiding with hobgoblins because their morale is so terrible and he doesn't give them the leadership bonus. So this is one where, much like I've changed the cost on some of the troops, I possibly will reduce the cost on this hobgoblin Khan. I think 70 gold's a bit high to pay for this guy. Yeah, so I might change that. What do the Chaos Dwarves get in terms of heroes and multi-heroes? We have the usual preview sites. We have the luck independent heroes, so these are the heroes that turn up via events, they're not tied to your luck scale. Here we have the Executioner of Hashut. This is a Bull Centaur Ancient, effectively, but souped up. Shator, the unfortunately named Shator, known as the Executioner. He is a Dominion Spreader, although he is not himself a priest, that means that he is permanently blessed. He has pumped up stats for a Bull Centaur Ancient, including significantly more hit points, significantly more protection, significantly more magic resistance, and so on. He comes with built-in fear, pretty good fear too, 8 instead of 5, which is the more standard value, so pretty decent fear. He has got Unsurroundable 4 rather than 2, so significantly better defense as things swarm all over him and stab him. And he comes with 2 special weapons. The Darktide Axe, you can see hits super hard, just like the regular axe, but it is magic and has better stats. So very accurate, very hard-hitting magical attack is great for killing other thugs and things like that, killing ethereal big things, big fire elementals, whatever else, he can really slap stuff down, and I really like the look of that axe. Very sleek looking. He's got the usual 2 extra bonus attacks then, and he's got the Will of Hashut, which is basically coming from this helmet that he has, the Mask of the Executioner. So I've represented that so that you can't have a different item in the head slot. It just gives him high protection and is magic. It's imbued, bit of a typo there, that should be imbued with malign spirits, which he unleashes upon his foes in battle, slaying them with a single utterance. So the Will of Hashut is a area effect 4, length 1 weapon, can't hit friendly units, and basically I think you just have the one use of that, is that right? Or do you get several uses of it? No, you get several uses of it. So basically, it checks whether you have enough magic resistance to stop it, and if you don't, you take 10 armor negating damage, and it doesn't affect various things, including friendly units. It can't be repelled, can't repelled. Yeah, so basically, as he's fighting, he uses the Will of Hashut to just blast people with armor negating damage if they don't have enough magic resistance, which can be great for clearing out chaff. So he's got a built-in high area of effect way of clearing out chaff. It's more magic damage, but bear in mind it's useless against mindless undead and animate. Luckily, doesn't hit friendlies. Yeah, so a bit of a beast. Throw some items on him if you can. He's got 3 misc slots, but he doesn't have a head slot that you can use, and he doesn't have any hand slots you can use because he is dedicated to using his special axe. But you can throw some better armor on him. He's already got good armor built in, but you can throw better armor definitely than a plate halberd, and 3 misc slots is very nice. Then we have a Hobgoblin Chieftain. This is Gorda's Backstabber. He is kind of a joke hero. He's pretty terrible, but his benefit is that because he's proven so difficult to kill over the many years that he has been sneaking around being a Hobgoblin Chieftain, he is immortal. He's got immortality 3 months. If he gets killed, he just comes back in 3 months. So he's a reusable leader. He's not very exciting for the purposes of thugging. I mean, he can do a little bit. He's got okay defense skill because of him being mounted. He's got unsurroundable 3. You can do a bit of thugging, but you don't really want to put items on him because when he dies, you don't get the items back. Maybe you could put some cheap items on him. Basically, he's kind of a joke leader. You use him to charge around with a bit of leadership. Maybe you could put one of those amulets of exploding on him and just keep using him like that, but I don't think it'd be a very good idea. When he appears, because of him being event-based, he comes with a bunch of hobgoblins as well, which is nice. Then we have the High Priest of Hashut, Astrogoth. He is the oldest of the Chaos Dwarf High Priests. He comes with Priest level 4, which is pretty powerful. It's great for doing banishment spam and things like that. Of course, he's another guy that can claim thrones for you and the like. He's got decent magic. It's not that exciting. You can do better with your Sorcerer Lords, I believe, but it's not too bad. He's really got more holy authority. He's started to turn to stone, but he's kind of managed to arrest it and built this exoskeleton for himself. So you can see he's got an extra pair of legs there and an extra pair of kind of arms attached to his arms. And because of this, he's got pretty decent stats. It gives him extra strength, hit points, protection, and so on. So you could do some thugging and the like with him. He's got 3 misc slots. Certainly possible to use him like that. But yeah, a bit more kind of flavour. But he's a pretty decent hero. He doesn't really give you any new magic paths or anything, but having priest level 4 is nice. And having a very tough mage is also quite nice. So what do you get for multi-heroes? Well, you just get the Sorcerer Lord. Simple as that. I felt like it wasn't worth having the Bull Centaur Ancient in there as a multi-hero as well, or the Demon Smith, because the Sorcerer Lord is the most exciting one. So yeah, sometimes you get a Sorcerer Lord turn up for free, which is nice. So I don't know that it's worth using luck scales for. You don't get the free Overlord with those multi-heroes, but yeah, it's an okay multi-hero. And that is it for heroes and multi-heroes. I said earlier in the video that I was going to talk about the enslaving and national mechanics after I talked about the commanders and units, and it's time now. So when you start the game with the Pierre, or whatever your god is named, the god of Zarnagrund, on the very first turn of the game, as in addition to the "Now the wheel has turned once again" message, absolutely iconic message that Dominions gives you, you also get an unexpected event has occurred message, which tells you a bit about your national mechanics. They have their enslavement, they have the stone curse, they have slavers, and they have fort pollution. So it covers all of these things. We've already talked about slavers, we've already talked about the stone curse, although this gives you the actual percentages, which is something I like to do for players to make things a bit less obscure so they don't have to go looking in the mod files or anything. Yeah, so we've got those explanations, don't need to go through those. We've talked about fort pollution a bit already at the start, so I won't talk about that, but I will talk about enslavement. So, when you conquer a province with a commander and you have 15 or more troops, and there's a little bit of fuzzy matching there, so sometimes like 13 troops can be enough to trigger it, and sometimes 15 or 16 troops can not be enough to trigger it. That's just a vagary of Dominions modding. If the province population is greater than 2,000, and again there's a little bit of fuzzy matching there, some of the population are enslaved and sent to one of your forts, granting resources, gold, population, and battle slaves. So the exciting things there really are that you get permanent resource increases, you get some gold as a one-off, and you get permanent population increase, which of course increases population, taxes, that's gold and recruitment points and resources. So it can be very good for pumping up your forts. If you've got more troops, then you can have an event that triggers for larger population, and if you've got even more troops, you can have an event that triggers for even larger population. Each size event can only trigger 3 times each turn for a total of 9 possible enslavement events. So if you're conquering tons and tons and tons of provinces and they're all big provinces and you have all huge armies in all of the provinces, then you're not going to get an unlimited number of these. Just because of the limitations to Dominions modding, you can only get a certain number of these enslavement events triggering each turn. If you need to think about it in thematic terms, maybe it's just that the Chaos Dwarf Empire can logistically only handle the enslavement of so many people at once. But yeah, some of the population enslaved means what you would think it mean in that the places that you're conquering will lose population. So if you have a big army and you're going out expanding and you're rolling over, particularly if you have a big army and you're rolling over, well, I say big, 25 plus is not that big, but you're rolling over provinces that have 66,000 or greater population, then you will be taking chunks of that population, sending it back to your capital. The good thing about it being in your capital, of course, is that presumably you've got the scales that you want in your capital, although you may have negative scales, and of course you do have the pollution pushing you towards death scales. But it does mean that they're being put into a useful place, a place you can protect more easily. You do have a bit of a problem of like many eggs in one basket kind of situation where if the enemy takes these forted provinces from you or hits you with remotes or things like that, it could be worse. But basically you're concentrating things into your provinces that have forts. At the start of the game, when you're taking a lot of these provinces, that's going to be your capital. So your capital is actually going to get bigger just in terms of population and things like that through constantly enslaving things. You're going to get free slaves, which is nice, as in battle slaves, the units that you can use to fight with. And I will demonstrate this to you. I will build a little force and we can go and see what the enslavement events are like. So I will prepare that now. Right, here we have a nice chunky force of Chaos Dwarfs. We've got 28 Chaos Dwarf warriors and 8 Chaos Dwarf blunderbusses behind them, led by an overlord. So if we take this force and we expand into one of these provinces that's next to us, we can see that we've got 5,860 there. I can't see how much there is for the other ones. I can build some scouts to go and check that. But let's say that we go in here and Batteries Rest. Do we think our force can beat the people in Batteries Rest? I suspect that they'll be fine to do so. So we'll give that a go and then I will show you the message. Here's the battle report for Batteries Rest. We didn't take any losses. You can see the blunderbusses absolutely annihilated these guys. I'll just show you this because why not, right? It's fun to see the blunderbusses doing something. Blunderbusses, blunderby. What's the plural of blunderbus? So there you can see them blazing away, absolutely shredding. They can fire pretty often, of course. And they're just absolutely tearing through those guys. And the Chaos Dwarf warriors are holding the line. So we take over this province. We've got plenty of troops, so we can trigger the biggest level of enslavement event. Let's have a look at the events. So we've got the event in Batteries Rest first. Having conquered this province, your forces have taken a good number of slaves and sent them back to labour in the capital. Labour is here, doing a lot of heavy lifting there. You conquered a province with more than 4,000 population, so this didn't trigger the more than 6,000 population one, even though it's a little bit fuzzy because the population was just too low, and had a commander and at least 20 troops present. Only 3 of this size of conquest event can trigger each turn. 380 population lost from that province that we just took, so that's significant. It's like 7% or so of the population. It's not nothing. But then in Zana Grund, we have a corresponding event. So if we had conquered multiple places, we would have multiple events then happening in Zana Grund or whatever other forted provinces. It's picked completely at random which forted province ends up getting the slaves from a particular enslavement event. But in Zana Grund, a decent number of slaves taken from a recently conquered province have arrived in the capital. Some have been sold, that gives you gold. Some set to work, that gives you province resources permanently, and some arms to be used as fodder in battle. 3d6 random slave troops. If you think about the slaves, they're worth, well, they cost 3 gold each. So 3d6 times 3 gold worth of stuff, that's not too bad. Let's look at what we actually got. So these are the slaves that we got. The more useful things in here, we've got some Orc War slaves, a human that you can use for patrolling, of course. They don't have the patrol malice, or do they? Oh no, they do have the patrol malice. My bad. Perhaps I should take that away from them. And the forge slaves. So yeah, don't use slaves to patrol, but you can use them as fodder in battle. So what if we were to take Kangshinjunga? I suspect this is going to have somewhat low population, and so we won't trigger the big event, but let's find out. Here's the battle report, the blunderbuss buses, and the Chaos Dwarf Warriors absolutely stomping another province here again. And we can see that we got more than 4,000 population, so another kind of mid-sized province, and so we get the same, similar decrease in population, this time a bit less. It's kind of slightly random, because that's just how Dominion spotting works. And then we get the same event here, so different number of slaves, presumably because it's a bit random, a little bit different gold, a little bit different increase in population and province resources. So Kanchenjunga used to have a bit over 5,000 population. Let's see if we can find one that's a big province and take it and see what that message looks like. So this is somewhat interesting. There's a battle in Larza. You can see, I know that I won this, and you can see that there's no enslavement event that happens. Now, why is that? Well, let's go and have a look. So we definitely won. We definitely had, over 15 troops left. We had plenty of troops left at the end of that battle. Killed off the barbarians. So why didn't anything trigger? Well, if we have a look at Larza, its population's too low. So yeah, you just can't trigger the enslavement event. There's not enough population for them to bother enslaving, so they don't. Here is a battle in Namche Bazaar. So we've still got enough units left. We've got plenty of units left. Took over this province, and this province was big enough, more than 6,000 population, so we get the bigger event. So more of the population disappears. This is nearly 10% of the population. If there are 6,000, I suspect it's less than 10% because they're probably a bit bigger than that as a province. And we get the big size of slave event back at Zana Grund. So you get 5d6 instead of 3d6. You get more gold, more population, more province resource increase. How big was the province we took? It looks like it was over 8,000, yeah. So big province, big gains, and you can see that our population has been pushed up by doing this, despite the fact that it's got death 1. So if we were to think about this strategically or tactically, the enslavement means that you have more eggs in your baskets, increases your population and value of your forted provinces. It means if you just keep your capital, everything just keeps going back to your capital. So you really will have all of your eggs in one basket there. It means as you're expanding and taking places, you get more population and resources collected underneath your own dominion. So you may want to have a fairly positive dominion because of that. It means that if you're at war with an enemy, then you have armies of a certain size. As you're rampaging through their lands, you're also just dragging their population off and sending them back to your forts, which can be a good or a bad thing, really. Overall, you're somewhat depopulating the world, because if we look at the messages that we get, when you take this province, you end up with gaining 230 population back in your capital, and this time you killed 540 population. So overall, you're decreasing, because slavery is a business that involves the death of a lot of the population. So pretty brutal stuff, can be a benefit to you. It's worth bearing in mind that if you want to avoid a slavery event triggering, let's say you've got a province where you really don't want the population to go down for whatever reason, then you could make sure that your force is small enough that it doesn't trigger the enslavement events. For instance, if you sent a super combatant on its own or an expander god or something, when they expanded out, they would not trigger the enslavement events because they don't have 15 troops there. If you want to make sure that you are triggering the enslavement events, but you've only got a small number of elite troops, let's say you've got 10 infernals and you think that's enough to take a province, what you might want to do is take some slaves along as well, just to push the numbers up so that you can trigger the enslavement events. Of course, you need 15 to trigger the lowest level of event, 20 to trigger the mid-level of event, and if it's a very big province, 25 will get you access to the big level of the enslavement event. So quite a few strategic considerations around that, I think. I hope that it also feels quite thematic, in that the Chaos Dwarves are not really interested in building an empire where they're ruling over people and the people are being productive. What they're interested in doing is plundering places and sending slaves back to toil in the mines of their various outposts and their capital. Now let's talk about the Chaos Dwarf spells. And it is plural, they have more than one spell, but only by one. They have just two spells available to them at the moment, the national spells. They've got all the basic spell book, of course. I may add more Chaos Dwarf spells in the future, but for now it's just these two. They're both in construction. At level 0, you get the Fund Sorcerer spell. So you can turn 20 fire gems into a sorcerer. They cost normally, I think it's 240 gold and, is it 2 or 3 commander points? 2 commander points, I believe. So your mainline mage, but you can just get extras of them. You can turn your fire gems into them. So if you get a good fire gem income, you can levy that into increased research, of course, because they're great researchers. Having more mages is just generally a fantastic thing. I think for 20 fire gems, it's a bit of a bargain. So yeah, you really want to get fire gems and just keep pumping out sorcerers as much as you can. One thing that's nice about having this spell is that it's a good way to replace the sorcerers that you're losing to the Stone Curse, because you're going to have a bit of attrition there. It could feel quite bad, but of course you're going to have so many sorcerers because of this. You'll be surprised how often and how useful it is to just use this, particularly because fire gems in the middle of the game don't tend to be massively valuable. Then, at construction level 4, you have the Forge Kadai Fireborn spell. It's Fire 3, Blood 1 to cast, so for the most part you will be doing it with your Sorcerer Lords. It's difficult to get Fire 3, if I'm remembering right, on your Sorcerers. Is that true? Let me check. No, I tell a lie. It's not difficult to do it. 1 in 4 of your sorcerers will have Fire 3, but what they won't have is Blood 1. So getting Fire 3 Blood 1 is more difficult. But yeah, you can get Fire 3 Blood 1 on your Sorcerer Lord. You can get Fire 3 Blood 1 by doing Empowerment or using boosters on your sorcerers. So once you've got that, you can do Forge Kadai Fireborn. You get 2 Fireborn for 8 gems. Basic summon. I will let you read the description by pausing if you want to, but let's have a look at the Fireborn. They are previewed here in Chaos Dwarf Summons, along with the Sorcerer, but we already know what he's like. Here is the Kadai Fireborn. So first things first, credit to Executor, a very talented Dominions modder, who helped me out by making this sprite for me. So it looks a little bit different from my normal sprites, but I think it looks really cool. He's like a kind of magmary, fire elemental animated suit of armor with some massive axes. Look at those cool axes. Very nice. So what do you get with the Kadai Fireborn? Well, they're gold 0, so they're upkeep free, of course. They are troops. You get 2 of them for 8 fire gems. So they are just 4 fire gems each. And you have a completely fire immune unit that comes with magic weapons. So if your opponent is attempting to use fire elementals, which would be a silly thing to do against Chaos Dwarfs, but they might be, the Kadai Fireborn will absolutely annihilate them. They have 2 of these attacks, very high damage because of their high strength. The Forge Axe also has a secondary if it manages to do damage, which is to do an additional 12 fiery magical damage. So if you're hitting things that don't have incredible protection and you're managing to damage them, you're going to just do a bunch more damage through the fire, which is very cool. They're magic beings, which makes them vulnerable to a bunch of things and means you need mages to lead them around, of course. They have a heat aura, so be careful where you position them. They're floating, immune to earthquakes and the like. And they have a pretty strong fire shield. 12 AP fire shield is very nice. So this is, for the cost, an absolutely superb unit. And if you can get a factory of these up and get them going, they're really great. But they do have a couple of big drawbacks. So first drawback is that their defense skill is not great. They have quite encumbering armor that they're wearing. And yeah, so consequently tend to end up with not the hottest. And of course they have defense penalties from having these forge axes. Not the hottest defense skill, so they will get hit a lot. So they have to rely on their protection and the fact that they just burn everything. But they've got decent number of hit points and decent protection, so it's not the worst thing in the world. The real problem with them is that they have exhaustion, which means at the start of the battle they won't have an encumbrance. As the battle progresses, every turn they will, instead of getting their fatigue back, they will just take more and more fatigue for every turn. So after you've been through 5 turns, they will have gained, in addition to all of the fatigue from running around fighting and things, because they do have encumbrance, they're not encumbrance free like undead or, long dead, things like that. You will have extra from the exhaustion, and they can exhaust themselves to death if they're just left sitting around, much like clockwork men. Clockwork soldiers and clockwork horrors can do this as well. They also have exhaustion, and the Kadai Fireborn are just like them. They will become exhausted. But in the time that they are active, and when they haven't got loads of fatigue, they will absolutely mash things. They're very powerful offensively. Their fire shield is extremely strong. Basically, the opponent is going to want to have fire resistance against them, or they're going to be in for a world of hurt. And even then, they hit very hard and do magic damage, so they're quite hard to counter. They do have decent magic resistance, but being magic, of course, there's a few things they're vulnerable to, and they are susceptible to cold. So if the opponent's throwing out Falling Frosts, Frozen Heart particularly will absolutely do a number on Kadai Fireborn, but Falling Frost can also hurt them, and various things like cold auras and stuff can be particularly nasty against them. But yeah, the Fireborn, I would say, well worth summoning a lot of in your mid game. They can be a very strong unit to get out, and they're very good counters for a lot of stuff the opponent will do. That is more or less everything I wanted to say about the nation, but of course let's have a quick look at the Pretender selection and just have a very quick think about what scales you might want. So the Pretender selection is very much themed around the kind of Assyrian style stuff, fire, death, blood, forging. Got the Titan of the Forge in there. You've got a bunch of big statues, statues of war. They love war. They like building big monuments. The Golden Idol seems appropriate for such a greedy nation, and various fiery things. So a fairly limited selection of stuff. I don't think they've got nature, for instance, on really any of this. Maybe I'm telling a lie. Maybe they do have nature on something. But yeah, they've got a bit more of a restrictive Pretender selection than most. Possibly I will add some more Pretenders to this, but this is what felt appropriate to me when I was going through stuff. Oh, yeah, they do have nature on the Great Black Bull, so that's an option for you. And of course, you can take Rainbow Bless and things on stuff like the Master Alchemist. What scale should they have? Well, I would say that you are almost certainly going to want production 3. You have very high resource cost. You can turn resources into useful stuff, basically. Having the extra income bonus is very nice because you will be able to ensure that you have a pretty decent amount of population underneath your own scales because of the enslavement mechanic, so production can also be helpful there. You've also got the ability to recruit things outside of your forts. You can recruit your slaves outside of your forts. You can recruit a few other things, Hobgoblin Wolf Riders and the like outside of your forts, and having more resources generally will enable you to do that more often. I think that having good order is also a good idea, just for the nice income synergy that it has with the production bonus. Because you are a fairly gold hungry nation, because you've got these resources from the production everywhere, you might want to have more recruitment points and things that have slightly reduced population, particularly if you've been going around enslaving stuff. So yeah, potentially you would want to have some order, and I think order and production is very thematic for the Chaos Dwarf Society. It is a very strictly hierarchical society. They are absolutely brutally enforcing their social order on everyone, not just themselves. So yeah, production and order, I would say. I would probably recommend taking magic because you can use your pyrophants to really crank up the research. You can also, if you've got a lot of fire gems, you can end up getting tons of sorcerers, and they benefit from the research from the magic scales as well. And possibly you could do, if you get the death gem income, you could get revenants up and benefit from magic there. I also think that magic scales, as opposed to the drain scales used by the non-chaos dwarves, is kind of thematic for the chaos dwarves. So maybe a bit of magic would be nice. Since you're already presumably taking order, you might not, but if you are taking order, you could maybe take a little bit of misfortune because you have the fewer events, but I think that's very much something I would just leave up to the player, whether they prefer misfortune or luck. Temperature scales, you take what you take, it's fine. I don't want to go into temperature scales, it's not that important. And then death scales wise, I think a thing that I have a lot of difficulty with when I'm designing these mods is to get people to push people towards taking thematic scales. Now, they can still do whatever they want, but ideally, you don't want to make a mod that's like, let's say you make a mod that's called Claws of Bone, Revenge of the Death Empire, and then the obvious thing to do is to take Growth 3. That seems really weird to me. It's better if you design a nation such that the obvious thing to do, the most intuitive thing to do, like the most thing that fits the theme of the nation the most, is also a sensible idea generally. And maybe if somebody comes up with some like wacky different way of building it, they can do something different. So for the Chaos Dwarves, what would make sense generally thematically is that they have a bit of death scales, really, because they're not a very high population nation in Warhammer, and they spread pollution and death everywhere. They do strip mining of everything. They destroy everything. They live in a wasteland, basically, in the setting, just inside these cities of brass, or this big capital city of brass and stone. So I think death scales are somewhat appropriate, and one of the reasons that I went with the pollution mechanic is to push you towards death scales to some extent. But I wouldn't really recommend taking Death 3 because you are going to be gathering lots of population underneath your own dominion because of the enslavement mechanics, and I think you will just end up starving yourself of your gold income. You'll also have trouble with your blood hunting, and blood hunting is definitely something the nation does want to do. They can get a pretty big blood economy going. So I would say on that front, if you take Death 1, that means that your pollution is effectively doing nothing bad to you. It's just keeping it the same as what you would have anyway from your scale. If you take High Growth, you can counteract the pollution a little bit on your forts, but in your capital, which is probably the most important province for the growth to be affecting, you're not really going to be getting the full benefit of taking High Growth. So basically, I would take Death 1. That would be my recommendation. You could take Death 2 if you just kind of go for like a little bit more of a bless or whatever, but yeah, I would maybe take Death 1. That's everything I wanted to say about the Chaos Dwarfs now, including all of the pretenders and scales bits. I hope that you've had fun listening to this. I hope it's piqued your interest in the mod. It's actually quite a important mod to me out of all of the Warhammer mods that I've made, because the Chaos Dwarves have always been like horribly underserved by Games Workshop. They basically created this race, they made them in the lore, they made some miniatures and things for them, and then they became like a cult classic. But then they absolutely just refused to release anything for them. And it's partly because they weren't ever really very popular at all. It was more that they had this kind of cult popularity, this very niche popularity. But people who love Chaos Dwarves, and I am one of those people. I think that they're fantastic. They're a really fun nation, and I hope that I've gotten their flavour and their theme across, and I hope they're a really fun nation to play. So I'd love to hear any feedback from you. Sound off in the comments. I know you love to do that. And find me on Discord. I am Sombre on Discord, of course. And yeah, follow the link and give the Mod Nation a try. If you've never tried a Mod Nation, you're just stumbling across this video, get Dominions 5, play with my Mod Nations. You'll have fun. I basically promise it. Okay, thanks everyone. And I will see you next time.